Just after 11 on a Tuesday in early March, a man in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, plugs in his electric sedan the way he has every night for the past 3 years. The car beeps softly, the dashboard glows, and the charging cable settles into its familiar rhythm. He goes upstairs, closes the bedroom door, and forgets about it. By morning, the car is full, and he leaves for work without a second thought. It is only later that week, when his utility statement arrives, that he notices something unusual. The kilowatt hours look the same, the mileage looks the same, but the bill is higher, and the line item responsible for the increase is one he has never seen before. It is labeled in small, neutral type as a grid integration adjustment. He calls the utility. The representative is polite and slightly rehearsed. She tells him that the charge is part of a new framework that took effect at the start of the year and that millions of customers across the country are now seeing some version of it on their bills. She uses the phrase smart grid cost recovery. She does not call it a tax. But across forums, group chats, and local news segments, the public has already settled on a shorter name for it, one that has begun to appear in headlines from Sacramento to Hartford. They are calling it the 2026 Smart Grid Tax. And the question of what it is, where it came from, and whether it is fair has quietly become one of the most consequential energy debates of the decade. To understand why this charge exists, it helps to step back from the bill itself and look at the physical machine that delivers electricity to a home. The grid, in its essence, is a vast and delicate balancing act. Every second of every day, the amount of electricity generated must match almost exactly the amount being consumed. There is no large reservoir of stored power waiting in the background. There are turbines spinning in coordinated rhythm, transmission lines humming at fixed frequencies, and operators in control rooms watching the system like air traffic controllers, nudging supply up or down to match demand. For most of the 20th century, this balance was relatively predictable. People woke up, used appliances in the morning, went to work, came home, cooked, watched television, and went to sleep. Industrial loads were stable. Weather was the main variable. Engineers could forecast demand within a narrow margin and plan generation accordingly. The arrival of the electric vehicle, in meaningful numbers, has changed that equation in ways that the public has only begun to feel. A single electric car charging overnight on a standard home circuit draws roughly the same amount of power as an entire household at peak use. Two cars on the same block charging at the same time can double the load on a neighborhood transformer that was sized in the 1980s for a very different America. Multiply that across tens of millions of vehicles, and the grid does not simply strain. It begins to behave in ways its original designers never anticipated. Transformers overheat and fail years ahead of schedule. Distribution lines sag under sustained loads. Substations that were once quiet at night now run nearly as hard as they do at noon. The romantic image of the electric vehicle as a clean, silent guest of the energy system gives way to something more complicated, which is that every car plugged into a wall is, in effect, a small industrial customer attached to a residential network. For a long time, utilities absorbed these stresses quietly. The number of electric vehicles was small enough that the costs could be folded into general infrastructure budgets and spread thinly across all ratepayers. But by the middle of the 2020s, that arithmetic stopped working. In several states, the share of electric vehicles on the road crossed thresholds that regulators and utility planners had identified years earlier as the point at which targeted investment would become unavoidable. The numbers were not abstract. In parts of California, neighborhood transformer replacements tripled in a single year. In the Pacific Northwest, utilities began publishing maps of circuits considered at risk of electric vehicle saturation. In Texas, where the grid operates under its own peculiar political and physical constraints, planners warned that uncoordinated overnight charging could become a reliability concern within the decade. Something had to be done, and the something that emerged In the long and unglamorous regulatory proceedings of 2024 and 2025 was the framework now showing up on millions of bills. The framework has many names, depending on the jurisdiction. In some states, it is called a grid modernization rider. In others, a distribution system charge. In a few, more bluntly, an electric vehicle infrastructure surcharge. But the underlying logic is similar across them. Utilities are permitted to recover, through small additions to customer bills, the cost of upgrading the parts of the grid most affected by the rise in electric vehicle charging. The charge is often calculated based on time of use, on the size of the local circuit, and on whether the customer has a registered high-power charging device. It is, in regulatory terms, a cost allocation mechanism. In practical terms, it means that the act of charging an electric vehicle at home, particularly at night, now carries an embedded fee that did not exist a year ago. What makes the situation contentious is not the existence of the charge, but the way it interacts with the promises that brought many drivers into electric vehicles in the first place. For most of the past decade, the case for owning an electric car included not only environmental considerations and the pleasure of the driving experience, but a straightforward economic argument. Electricity, the reasoning went, was cheaper than gasoline, and overnight charging at home, in particular, was the cheapest of all, because demand on the grid was low and rates were correspondingly modest. Drivers built their financial expectations around this. Some bought vehicles on the assumption that fuel costs would drop by half or more. Some installed home charging equipment that cost thousands of dollars, justified by years of projected savings. The new charge does not erase those savings, but it narrows them, and in some cases, depending on the household and the rate structure, it narrows them considerably. The deeper grievance, voiced in public hearings and consumer advocacy filings throughout the past year, is one of fairness. Critics argue that the charge effectively penalizes drivers for behavior that policy itself encouraged. State and federal incentives spent more than a decade pushing consumers toward electric vehicles. Tax credits, rebates, carpool lane access, and public charging investments were all designed to accelerate adoption. To turn around now, these critics say, and impose a new fee on the very act of charging is to change the terms of an agreement after the fact. Utilities, for their part, respond that the charge is not a penalty but a reflection of real costs that someone must bear. If electric vehicle drivers do not pay for the upgrades their vehicles necessitate, those costs fall on customers who do not own such vehicles, many of whom are lower-income households without the means to participate in the transition. Both arguments have merit, and the regulatory record from the past 2 years is full of long, careful attempts to reconcile them. The technical reality underneath the debate is more nuanced than either side tends to acknowledge in public. The charge is not, strictly speaking, a tax on charging. It is a mechanism designed to send a price signal, a concept that has been part of utility economics for decades, but is only now being applied to residential customers at scale. The idea is that if charging at certain hours costs more, drivers will shift their behavior, spreading demand across the night rather than concentrating it in the first few hours after they arrive home. In jurisdictions where the charge is structured carefully, with clear time bands and predictable rates, early data suggests that this is exactly what happens. Drivers program their vehicles to begin charging at 2 or 3 in the morning when system demand is lowest and the additional cost falls away or disappears entirely. In jurisdictions where the structure is less transparent or where the charge applies more broadly, the price signal becomes noise, and customers experience it simply as a higher bill with no clear way to respond. This is where the phrase "costing more tonight" becomes literal rather than rhetorical. In many parts of the country, the new framework has redefined what counts as off-peak. The traditional pattern in which electricity was cheapest, from roughly 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, has been compressed and shifted. The hours immediately after dinner, once considered the gentle slope down from peak demand, are now treated in some regions as a secondary peak, driven almost entirely by electric vehicle charging. The cheapest hours have moved later, sometimes much later, into the night. A driver who plugs in at 9 and assumes the old rates are still in effect may now be paying premium prices for the first several hours of the charging session. The vehicle, indifferent to the change, simply draws power as instructed. The cost accumulates quietly, recorded by a meter that updates every 15 minutes and reports to the utility in near real time. The technology that makes this possible is itself part of the story. The smart grid, in the sense that policymakers and engineers use the term, is not a single project but a long, gradual replacement of analog infrastructure with digital infrastructure. Meters that once spun mechanically and were read by a human walking through a neighborhood have been replaced in most American homes with electronic devices that communicate continuously with the utility. Transformers are being equipped with sensors. Substations are gaining computational capacity. Distribution lines are being instrumented in ways that allow operators to see for the first time what is actually happening at the edges of the system. This visibility is what makes detailed cost allocation possible. It is also what makes the new charges feel, to some customers, like a form of surveillance, because the utility now knows, with considerable precision, when each home is drawing power and for what likely purpose. The privacy dimension of the debate has received less attention than the financial one, but it is not trivial. The pattern of electric vehicle charging is highly distinctive. A vehicle drawing 7 or 11 kilowatts continuously for several hours leaves a signature in the data that is unmistakable. From this signature, a utility can infer not only that a household owns an electric vehicle, but, in many cases, what kind of vehicle, how far it was driven that day, and over time, the rough pattern of its owner's life. This information is, in most jurisdictions, treated as confidential, but the legal frameworks governing its use are still maturing, and the question of who may eventually access it, under what conditions, remains open. Beneath all of this lies a question that the public conversation has only begun to confront, which is whether the grid as it currently exists can support the energy transition that policy has set in motion. The honest answer, given by engineers in technical settings, if not always in political ones, is that it cannot, at least not without substantial investment. The transformers, lines, and substations that carry electricity from generation to home were built for a slower, smaller, more predictable world. Replacing them is not a matter of months, but of decades. And the workforce, materials, and supply chains required for the task are themselves under strain. The new charges on customer bills are, in this larger context, a small and visible part of a much larger reckoning. They represent the moment at which the cost of modernization began to appear in places where ordinary people could see it. There's a temptation, when confronting a development like this, to frame it as a betrayal or a scandal. The reality is more ordinary and, in some ways, more difficult. The grid is being asked to do something it was not designed to do, and the people who depend on it are being asked to share, in modest but real ways, the cost of adapting it. Whether the current allocation of that cost is fair, whether the price signals are well designed, whether the charges should fall more heavily on utilities, manufacturers, or taxpayers rather than on individual drivers are all legitimate questions, and they are being argued in regulatory proceedings, courtrooms, and legislatures across the country. The outcomes will vary by state, by utility, and by the particular politics of each jurisdiction. There will be no single resolution. For the man in Ohio, plugging in his car at 11 on a Tuesday night, the immediate question is more practical. He learns after some research that he can program his vehicle to delay charging until 2 in the morning, and that doing so will reduce or eliminate the new charge on most nights. He does this, and the next month, his bill returns to something close to what it used to be. He continues to drive the car. He continues, on balance, to spend less on fuel than he did in the years before. But the experience has changed the way he thinks about the system he is part of. The grid is no longer an invisible utility that simply responds to his needs. It is a network of physical and economic constraints, and his vehicle, like every other electric vehicle, is now visibly part of those constraints. The cost of charging tonight is slightly higher than it was a year ago, and the reasons for that increase, traced back through transformers and substations and regulatory filings, lead eventually to a simple observation. The transition that was promised quietly, in the language of incentives and rebates, is now arriving more loudly, in the language of bills. What it will mean in the long run depends less on the charges themselves than on whether the public, the utilities, and the policymakers who shape the transition can agree on how to share what it actually costs.